The murder clue in the sewing basket. A Miss Marple Mystery. Dear listeners, welcome to tonight's Miss Marple Mystery. I'm Jane, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you here for another captivating tale. Before we dive in, I'd love to get to know you a little better. What's one hobby or passion that brings you joy? Are you into baking, painting, gardening, or perhaps something completely unexpected? Drop your answer in the comments. I always enjoy learning more about our wonderful community. Now, let's get cozy and begin tonight's story. Chapter 1. The Silken Thread of Gossip. The September afternoon drifted lazily over St. Mary Mead, its light the colour of honey slanting through lace curtains at Lavender Cottage. The air smelled faintly of lavender polish and fresh sponge cake, and somewhere outside a blackbird called across the hedgerows. Miss Marple sat by the open window, a small figure in dove grey, arranging cups on the low table with careful precision. Afternoon tea in her mind was not simply a habit, it was a gentle ceremony that kept the world in proper order. When Mrs. Bantry arrived, rosy-cheeked and puffing slightly from the walk, that order felt deliciously complete. "Oh, my dear Jane," Mrs. Bantry sighed, lowering herself into the chintz armchair. "I've just seen the oddest thing. The new widow, Mrs. Pargeter, out trimming roses in her night clothes. Mind you, I may be mistaken, but it looked most peculiar." Miss Marple poured the tea, her movements unhurried. "Perhaps she couldn't sleep," she said mildly. "Many widows find the nights the hardest." "Yes, but it's been a year, hasn't it? And she's forever sewing that." Lights burning at midnight, curtains drawn. "Such industry is all very well, but one does wonder." Miss Marple offered a thin slice of lemon. "Sewing soothes the nerves," she replied, though her blue eyes glimmered with thought. Mrs. Pargeter, quiet, delicate, a stranger among familiar faces, had been a topic of curiosity ever since she rented Rosehill Cottage. She rarely came to church, spoke softly when spoken to, and always carried a little wicker basket lined with pale muslin. The village, kind though it liked to appear, was not immune to whispers. The teacups chimed gently as Mrs. Bantry went on. "I heard from Miss Hartnell at the post office that she receives letters every Thursday. Foreign stamps sometimes. She never posts anything back." "Odd, don't you think?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Perhaps she has a correspondent abroad, a brother maybe." "Still, I dare say people's private letters are rather duller than we imagine." Mrs. Bantry chuckled. "You always defend the poor creatures we gossip about, Jane. Still, I wouldn't be surprised if there's romance involved. She has the look of someone waiting. For what, I couldn't say." The ticking clock filled a brief silence. Outside, the light softened toward amber. A petal fell from the vase between them, settling on the tablecloth like a sigh. Miss Marple noticed it absently. She was thinking of those Thursday letters, of the rhythm of their arrival, and the curious stillness that followed. People's habits, she often said, revealed far more than their words. When Mrs. Bantry helped herself to another slice of cake, Miss Marple rose to fetch more napkins. From the hallway, she glimpsed the distant shape of Rosehill Cottage beyond the garden gate. Its roofline caught the afternoon sun, a single window gleaming like a mirror. For a moment she fancied she saw movement behind the curtain, a shadow bending close, as if searching for something dropped. Then it was gone. Returning, she found Mrs. Bantry expounding upon a parish committee matter. Miss Marple listened with her usual patience, nodding at intervals, her mind half elsewhere. The rhythmic murmur of her friend's voice mingled with the ticking clock and the faint hum of bees outside, all merging into the kind of peaceful monotony that made small details stand out sharply. When the tea was finished and Mrs. Bantry departed, the cottage settled into its evening hush. Miss Marple cleared the table, folded the linen cloth, and paused by the window once more. The sun had slipped behind the yew trees, leaving the air brushed with violet. Down the lane, Rosehill Cottage stood almost hidden in mist, save for one golden glow in the upper window. The light trembled faintly as though a candle were being moved from place to place. "Still sewing, my dear?" Miss Marple murmured under her breath. The words held no malice, only a gentle curiosity that seemed to ripple through the quiet room. She reached to draw the curtains, then hesitated. Somewhere beyond the hedges a latch clicked, a gate, perhaps, or merely the wind. The evening air carried the faintest scent of roses and something metallic, like a sewing needle warmed by touch. She closed the curtains softly. The last sound was the rustle of lace falling back into place and the faint, steady tick of the clock marking the close of day, an ordinary end, yet touched by the smallest tremor of unease. Morning came to St. Mary Mead, wrapped in mist. The air hung still over the hedgerows, and the cobbles glistened faintly from a night's fine drizzle. Inside Lavender Cottage the kettle was singing, its thin whistle rising and falling as Miss Marple arranged her breakfast tray. The fire murmured in the hearth. Toast waited on a china plate beside her favourite pot of marmalade. It was the sort of quiet beginning she cherished, until a knock, brisk but uncertain, rattled the front door. She glanced at the clock on the mantel, barely 8:30. Few visitors called so early unless there was news to carry. Setting down her teacup, she tied her shawl more snugly and opened the door to find Constable Harris standing awkwardly on the step, cap in hand. His round face was pale from the chill, his boots flecked with dew. "Morning, Miss Marple," he began, his voice oddly subdued. "I'm sorry to disturb you so soon, but, well, there's been a bit of trouble up at Rosehill Cottage." Her hands, folded neatly before her, stilled. "Mrs. Pargeter?" He nodded. "I'm afraid so, ma'am. Found her this morning." The maid came in and, well, she was sitting in her chair by the hearth. Looked peaceful enough. Doctor thinks it's her heart. "Poor lady must have gone sudden in the night." Miss Marple stepped aside, motioning him toward the small sitting room. "Do come in, Mr. Harris. You look chilled to the bone." He hesitated, but followed, perching on the edge of a chair while she poured him a cup of tea. The steam clouded his spectacles, and he removed them, wiping nervously with a handkerchief. "Such a shock," he muttered. "You'd never have guessed anything was wrong. House tidy as ever, not a thing out of place, save for the sewing basket. Must have fallen when she slipped. Threads everywhere, little reels rolling across the rug. Gave the maid quite a fright." Miss Marple paused in the act of pouring milk. "Sewing basket, you say?" "Yes, ma'am," right beside her chair. "Looks like she'd been mending something, needle still threaded. Funny that." Half the lights were on, too. She handed him his tea. Mrs. Pargeter was fond of her sewing. "I suppose one could call it her company in solitude." He nodded, grateful for the warmth of the cup. "Doctor says she'd have felt nothing. Still, we'll have to notify her solicitor and all that." Sad business. They sat a moment listening to the fire crackle. Miss Marple's gaze had drifted to her embroidery frame on the table, a half-finished sampler waiting patiently beneath the lamplight. Pale blue thread gleamed against linen, fine as spider silk. The colour reminded her suddenly of something she'd seen last evening, the same shade perhaps, glinting through Mrs. Pargeter's curtains when that candle flickered too long after dark. "Will there be an inquest, do you think?" she asked softly. "Routine, ma'am." "Nothing suspicious." He rose, setting the cup down carefully. "I only thought I ought to tell you myself, seeing as you were always kind to her." "We'll close the place till the relatives arrive." Miss Marple accompanied him to the door. The mist was thinning now, curling away to reveal the lane glistening pale silver. The church bell began its slow toll for morning prayers, deep and deliberate. Harris adjusted his cap. "Thank you for the tea, Miss Marple," she smiled faintly. "It was no trouble, I assure you." When he had gone, she stood on the step for a long while, watching the faint figure vanish into the fog. Then she turned back inside, the quiet closing around her once more. The house felt too still. On the table, her embroidery waited, a row of tiny, even stitches, the needle poised as if caught mid-thought. She reached for it, but her fingers hovered instead, eyes narrowing just slightly. "People tell more than they mean to," she murmured, almost to the clock on the mantel. Outside, the bell continued to sound across the green, solemn, rhythmic, and strangely comforting, as though marking the beginning of something not yet understood. Chapter 2. Threads and Whispers. Miss Marple walked up the winding path to Rosehill Cottage, her wicker basket of daisies swinging lightly from her arm. The morning mist clung to the rose hedges, softening the edges of the cottage and lending it a quiet, almost dreamlike air. From a distance, the house appeared unchanged, the windows shining faintly in the gentle sun, yet she could feel the subtle weight of disturbance lingering like the aftertaste of a bitter tea. The lane was silent, save for a sparrow calling from the eaves and the faint rustle of leaves stirred by a mild breeze. She paused at the door, straightening her hat and smoothing her gloves. Inside, the parlour was unnervingly neat, as if someone had polished away not only dust, but also the traces of ordinary life. The fire had long since died, leaving only a faint warmth, and the curtains were drawn with military precision. The smell of lavender hung faintly in the air, mingling with the sharp scent of wax polish. Miss Marple set down the flowers, noticing instantly the sewing basket open beside the armchair. A spool of pale blue thread hung loose, draping delicately over the edge, its presence at once domestic and oddly telling. Near the fireplace, Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, whispered hurriedly to Inspector Craddock. Her voice was low, trembling with a mixture of curiosity and propriety. "Do you think it was sudden, sir?"
"So very sudden."
Miss Marple's eyes, however, were drawn elsewhere. The maid, Elsie, stood close to the doorway, hands clasped, her face pale and uncertain. She shifted nervously from foot to foot, glancing at the inspector as if seeking reassurance. Miss Marple crouched slightly, her gaze sweeping the floor. A small scrap of linen peeked from beneath the chair leg, edges unevenly torn. She recognized immediately that it was not part of Mrs. Pargeter's garments. Her lips curved in a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Such meticulous women rarely left things untidy, yet here lay a tiny fragment of disarray, a whisper of disorder among perfection. She moved slowly toward the basket, taking in its contents with unobtrusive attention. Threads of every color were coiled neatly, embroidery needles tucked in small pockets of fabric. Her fingers itched to examine them further, yet she restrained herself, knowing the importance of quiet observation over interference. The angle of the armchair, the tilt of the small footstool, the placement of cushions, all spoke, silently, to habits, to rituals, to the shape of life now ended. Mrs. Price leaned closer to the inspector again, her whisper sharp enough for Miss Marple to catch. "Did she have any enemies?"
"Anyone who might," she faltered, lowering her voice.
The inspector shook his head politely, his brow furrowed, making notes with methodical care. Miss Marple nodded softly to herself. People revealed far more than they intended through casual words, unguarded gestures, and the smallest domestic anomalies. She lingered a moment, her gaze returning to the spool of blue thread. It gleamed faintly, catching the light as if aware of her scrutiny. Her thoughts traced patterns in her mind, connecting subtle observations with faint rumors, untold stories whispered in passing. A single misplaced item, a slight tear in linen, a thread left dangling, each a fragment of understanding waiting to be assembled. The room felt almost sacred in its stillness. Outside, a crow cawed faintly, and the wind shifted, sending a shiver along the drapery. Miss Marple's eyes rested once more on the sewing basket, quiet, precise, and intimate in its revelation. No one else noticed the depth of her attention, nor the calm certainty in the way her mind began to weave what others only saw as chaos. She breathed softly, collecting impressions as though threading a needle, preparing for the careful stitching together of truth. The evening air carried a gentle chill as dusk deepened over St. Mary Mead. Lavender Cottage glowed softly from within, the lamplight spilling warmth onto the flagstone path, while shadows lengthened across the tidy garden. Miss Marple had just settled into her favourite chair, her knitting resting lightly in her lap, when a hesitant knock at the door interrupted the quiet rhythm of the hour. She rose slowly, smoothing her skirt, and opened it to find Miss Hartnell, the postmistress, standing with a pale envelope clutched tightly in her gloved hands. "Oh, Miss Marple," the woman said, her voice almost a whisper. "I thought I should bring this straight away. Found it near the postbox this afternoon. No stamp, and addressed to Mrs. Pargeter. She held the envelope as though it might vanish if handled too roughly. The handwriting was angular, a careful man's hand, unfamiliar to Miss Marple. "Thank you, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently, taking the envelope. She noted the crispness of the paper, the faint scorch marks along one corner, as though it had brushed too close to a candle's flame. Setting it on the small table beside her lamp, she gestured for Miss Hartnell to sit. The postmistress's eyes flitted nervously around the room, taking in the soft amber glow and the quiet domesticity, a stark contrast to the message she carried. Miss Marple unfolded the letter carefully, the paper crackling faintly. The words inside were brief, almost cryptic, speaking of unfinished matters and a debt long owed. The tone suggested urgency, though it had been tempered with restraint, as if the writer feared being overheard or discovered. Miss Marple's fingers lingered on the delicate folds. She felt a subtle shiver run through her, not from fear, but from the sudden clarity that even a small piece of paper could hold secrets capable of reshaping lives. Miss Hartnell shifted, wringing her hands lightly.
"I thought it might mean something, or
perhaps nothing at all. But I remembered your keen eyes, Miss Marple. You may see what I cannot. I shall see what it has to say," Miss Marple murmured, folding the edges gently. She placed it beside her half-finished embroidery, the pale blue thread gleaming faintly in the lamplight. Her mind began turning over possibilities, the writer, the intent, the connection to Mrs. Pargeter's quiet habits, the nightly sewing that had so often caught her attention. Something about the thread seemed familiar, the colour, the care, the precision. It mirrored the letter's tone in a subtle, almost imperceptible way. Outside, the village had begun to settle into its nightly rhythm. Windows glowed warmly behind curtains, hearths whispered behind doors, and the soft shuffle of a late cat or two traced along the lane. Miss Marple's gaze lingered for a moment on the garden gate, where a single thread of blue silk, caught by the wind, lay across the stone path. It glimmered faintly beneath the rising moon, delicate and insistent, like a whisper from the departed, unseen yet undeniable. She replaced the envelope carefully, her thoughts circling around the man who had written it, the meaning of his words, and the tiny domestic signals that might reveal more than they intended. The world outside was calm, but inside the quiet house hummed with the faintest undercurrent of unease. One small scrap of silk, one charred corner of paper, and the rhythm of village life had shifted imperceptibly. Miss Marple leaned back, the lamplight casting soft shadows over her lined face, and allowed herself a moment to consider the web quietly extending before her. Somewhere, not far, secrets whispered across hedges and along cobbled lanes, awaiting discovery by eyes attentive enough to see what others overlooked, and she, as always, would notice. Chapter 3. Patterns in Cloth and Character. The fire in Lavender Cottage flickered gently, sending soft amber light dancing across the walls. Miss Marple sat in her favourite chair, embroidery frame balanced delicately on her knees. Her needle moved with steady rhythm, each tiny stitch forming patterns she had traced 1,000 times before, yet tonight her hands worked more slowly, thoughtfully, as if guided by memory as much as by fabric. Outside, a mild wind stirred the last golden leaves along the hedgerows, whispering against the window panes. The cottage smelled faintly of tea and beeswax, ordinary comforts against which extraordinary thoughts quietly pressed. Her mind wandered back 2 years to the arrival of Mrs. Pargeter at Rose Hill Cottage. She had been a woman of undeniable refinement, yet there had been something delicate and taut beneath her calm exterior, a nervousness that betrayed itself in the curl of her fingers when arranging her gloves, the careful choice of words. She had spoken often of starting anew, as though the past were a garment too tight, needing to be cast aside. Miss Marple recalled the meticulous care with which the widow unpacked her china, arranged her curtains, and lined her shelves. Every act deliberate, every gesture precise, yet somehow the air had always carried a faint tension. a sense that she expected the world to unravel around her at any moment. Gossip, as it inevitably did, followed Mrs. Pargeter through the village. Miss Marple remembered snippets. A quarrel with a man named Mr. Collins, whose presence lingered in the inn, and whispers of business dealings left behind by her late husband. None of it scandalous, none of it immediate, yet the threads wove themselves into subtle patterns in the mind of the observer. Behaviour, she often said, was a map to character. Small habits revealed the outline of intent, even when words were measured. Her needle paused, hovering above the fabric. She thought of the sewing basket at Rosehill Cottage, the loose thread of pale blue, the small scrap of linen that did not belong to the widow's garments. Such details were ordinary, domestic, almost trivial, but in them lay hidden truths. Like a stitch following the curve of a pattern, the behaviours of Mrs. Pargeter now seemed to point to something inevitable. There was no sign of rage, no hint of passion-driven crime, but a subtler force, fear. The careful stitching of her life had left tiny clues of tension, reminders of secrets carried with delicate hands. Miss Marple leaned back, her eyes tracing the threads under the lamplight. She considered the man, Mr. Collins, staying quietly at the inn, the lingering questions about accounts and quarrels, the rhythm of letters delivered and unanswered. Each observation threaded itself into a coherent whole, like the embroidery beneath her fingers. Somewhere in that sewing basket, she thought, lay more than blue silk and needles. It held a woman's last attempt to arrange her life in order, to mark a truth that might otherwise remain hidden. Outside, dusk settled fully upon the village, folding Rosehill Cottage and its secrets into quiet shadow. Miss Marple breathed softly, threading her needle once more, her mind weaving together memory, gossip, and observation. The evening deepened, warm and tranquil, yet beneath it ran the faint tension of lives intersecting, small signs pointing to outcomes unseen. She stitched deliberately, following the rhythm of thought as much as the thread, knowing that piece by piece the shape of what had occurred would reveal itself. The Swan Inn smelled of polished wood and lingering ale, a comforting blend that always seemed to promise warmth against the crisp evening air outside. Miss Marple stepped through the door, the bell tinkling softly above her head. Inside, a low fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the worn carpet and well-loved furniture. A few patrons murmured quietly over mugs of tea and pints of beer, their voices blending into a soft hum that settled over the room like a gentle curtain. She approached the innkeeper with a nod and asked if she might see Mr. Collins, who had been staying upstairs. He was seated near the fire, a polished cufflink between his fingers, frowning slightly as he worked at repairing it. His posture was precise yet tense, and when he noticed Miss Marple he stood quickly, smoothing the front of his jacket with careful attention. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, his voice polite, though edged with a nervous flutter. "What brings you here at this hour?" "I thought I might pay my respects," she replied, smiling faintly, her eyes taking in the small gestures of discomfort he could not conceal. She seated herself opposite him, placing her hands neatly on the table.
You knew Mrs. Pargeter's husband in London, did you not?"
Yes, he said, nodding earnestly. "We were acquaintances, business mostly, quite a long time ago. I had not expected to be mentioned in connection with this." His fingers tightened around the cufflink, betraying the anxiety he otherwise attempted to mask. Miss Marple reached into her handbag and produced the envelope Miss Hartnell had delivered earlier. She did not reveal its contents, only letting it rest on the table. His eyes flickered toward it involuntarily, and his hand trembled just slightly as he adjusted his sleeve. She observed calmly, allowing the silence to stretch between them. There was much said in the quiet moments, often more than in words themselves. Behind him, a young maid dusted the mantel, inadvertently nudging a small painting askew. A faint blue thread, thin and delicate, caught on the frame and shimmered in the lamplight. Miss Marple's gaze softened as she followed the glimmer, her eyes meeting Mr. Collins's without accusation. How curious, she murmured gently, her voice carrying no judgment, only observation. Blue seems to follow you, Mr. Collins. He gave a polite cough, but his eyes betrayed an almost imperceptible startle. The thread, the letter, the neat movements of his hands, they were small signals, ordinary and yet full of meaning. Miss Marple allowed herself a slight smile. Human nature often revealed itself in the smallest details, she reflected. Sometimes a thread left behind, a hesitation in speech, or a careful adjustment of a cufflink spoke louder than any confession. She rose, straightening her coat and basket, and nodded her thanks to the innkeeper. The fire popped behind her, sending a warm glow across the polished floorboards, and she allowed herself a backward glance at Mr. Collins. His gaze darted almost imperceptibly toward the envelope she had placed aside, and she felt the subtle tightening of the threads of observation she had begun to weave. Outside, the wind carried the scent of late summer roses from the garden, and the evening darkened into a soft indigo. Miss Marple's mind turned gently over what she had seen, the careful anxiety of a man, the curious thread, the undisturbed yet telling environment of the inn. Each small detail she knew would eventually link itself together, forming a pattern invisible to most, but not to her. Chapter 4. The Stitches of Deception. Elsie arrived at Lavender Cottage in the late afternoon, her small frame trembling beneath the worn coat she had wrapped tightly around herself. She knocked softly, then entered before Miss Marple could speak, her eyes bright with unshed tears. The girl's hands clutched a folded piece of linen to her chest, knuckles white, and her breathing came in short, anxious bursts. Miss Marple, sitting by the window with her embroidery paused on her lap, gestured toward the armchair nearest the fire.
"Come in, my dear," she said gently.
"Sit. There's nothing to fear here." Elsie obeyed, lowering herself into the chair with a shiver. Miss Marple poured a cup of tea, letting the warm aroma fill the room before offering it across the table. The girl's hands closed around the cup as if it were an anchor.
I didn't mean any harm, Ma'am," she began, voice barely above a whisper. I thought she was being blackmailed. I wanted to protect her. You hid a letter."
Miss Marple asked softly, her tone neither reproachful nor surprised. She had learned long ago that truths often arrived in trembling voices rather than bold declarations. Elsie nodded, tears spilling freely now. "Yes, ma'am.
I found it near the door one morning. Meant for Mrs. Pargeter. I kept it. I thought if she read it, she might be hurt, or worse. I didn't know what else to do." She swallowed hard. "I thought I was helping her, but—"
"I think I only made things worse." Miss Marple listened quietly, her eyes calm, her hands resting lightly on the embroidery frame. She offered a reassuring smile and let the girl speak, knowing that sometimes understanding came first, before action.
"And that night?"
she prompted gently. "The night she—"
"Passed away?"
Elsie's gaze dropped to the floor. "I saw her in the sitting room. She was embroidering a handkerchief. There were initials. C.W. She whispered to herself that she wanted it finished before morning. She worked so quietly, so carefully.
I didn't want to disturb her." Miss Marple's lips pressed together in thought.
Blue thread, initials, a handkerchief, small domestic things ordinary, yet capable of holding weight far beyond their appearance. She traced the corner of her own embroidery with her needle, considering how the simplest gestures of care could preserve a truth or hide one entirely. Each stitch, she reflected, was deliberate, a small mark against the vast, messy pattern of human behaviour. Elsie glanced up, searching Miss Marple's face for judgment.
Do you think she knew someone was trying to hurt her?"
she asked quietly. Miss Marple shook her head slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to indicate thought, not accusation. Perhaps she did, perhaps she did not. What matters is that she left these small traces, threads, initials, patterns, to tell her story in the only way she could. It is rarely the grand gestures that reveal intent, my dear, but the quiet, careful things we leave behind. The girl's shoulders relaxed slightly, the first relief brushing through her tension. Miss Marple poured a second cup of tea, the steam curling gently into the soft light of the room. Outside, the wind whispered among the hedges, carrying the faint scent of roses and the distant church bells, marking the passage of time. In the warmth of the lamplight, the shadows of the room stretched and softened, and the ordinary calm held within it the faint promise of unravelling truths, hidden in the smallest stitches of a quiet life. The room at the Women's Institute Hall was warm and inviting, scented faintly with lavender polish and the sweet aroma of recently baked scones. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, falling upon the polished oak tables where ladies of the village gathered, each absorbed in the quiet rhythm of sewing, knitting, or mending. Miss Marple settled herself in a corner, embroidery frame resting lightly on her lap, her eyes scanning the familiar faces with a gentle, patient interest. Conversation floated through the air like a soft thread, mingling domestic tips with the inevitable turn toward more curious topics. "Did you hear about Mrs. Pargeter?" whispered Mrs. Bantry to her neighbour, a glint of excitement in her voice. "Found so suddenly, poor thing. And all so mysterious." Miss Marple's gaze followed the movement of Mrs. Bantry's hands as she threaded her needle, and her eyes caught something familiar, a spool of pale blue silk, delicate and vibrant, slipping smoothly between fingers. "From the market," Mrs. Bantry said, almost in answer to a thought Miss Marple had not spoken aloud. Though only one shop sells this shade, Miss Marple allowed herself the faintest of smiles.
"Ah, haberdashery Finch," she murmured softly, almost to herself.
The words were not meant to startle anyone, yet the subtle mention seemed to ripple gently through the circle. Each woman glanced at her briefly, some with curiosity, others with polite acknowledgment, all returning soon to the ordinary tasks at hand. The conversation meandered back to patterns and fabrics, recipes for jam and sponge cake, the latest arrangements for the village fete. Yet beneath the chatter, Miss Marple observed the small, almost imperceptible shifts in expression, the way hands fidgeted over needle and thread, the brief flicker of surprise when a topic brushed too close to Mrs. Pargeter's absence. Each stitch in the air, each laugh or gasp, seemed to leave a faint impression, like tiny marks on a page waiting to be read correctly. She leaned forward slightly, catching the light on the pale blue silk in Mrs. Bantry's hands. It was the same subtle hue she had noticed at Rose Hill Cottage, a thread connecting a casual domestic moment with the faintly unsettling events that had unfolded. In the calm, rhythmic murmur of voices she traced a pattern, small hints woven into ordinary gestures, whispered suspicions folded neatly into polite conversation. The hum of the room, the scrape of needles, the gentle rustle of fabric, the faint clink of pins in a cushion felt almost like the sound of clues stitching themselves into place. Miss Marple's eyes roamed over each woman, noting curiosity mingled with discretion, excitement tempered by propriety. Secrets could be spoken quietly or left unspoken, yet they often revealed themselves in the most ordinary settings, disguised as idle chatter and careful attention to domestic tasks. She settled back in her chair, the soft sunlight warming her shoulders, her fingers moving methodically through her embroidery. The village's pulse continued around her, calm yet insistent, the ordinary rhythm of life carrying hidden echoes. Somewhere in the hum of sewing and the quiet exchange of fabrics and threads lay the faint trace of truth, waiting for eyes willing to notice the subtle connections threaded through the seemingly mundane. Chapter 5. The Shopkeeper's Tale. The bell above Finch's haberdashery tinkled softly as Miss Marple stepped inside, greeted by the familiar warmth of polished wood, the scent of cotton and thread, and the quiet hum of a well-kept shop. Spools of silk and ribbon were arranged neatly on shelves, and baskets brimming with buttons, needles, and pins invited the careful eye to linger. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the front windows, catching the glimmer of sequins and the pale sheen of silk, casting a gentle glow over the tidy interior. She approached the counter where Mr. Finch, a man of precise habits and kindly manner, was arranging a stack of lace handkerchiefs. "Good afternoon, Mr. Finch," she said softly. I wondered if you might help me. I am looking for a particular thread, a pale blue silk, fine as gossamer. Have you sold any recently?" He paused, furrowing his brow as he sifted through his memory. "Ah, yes," he said after a moment. "Just last week I sold some blue silk. Not to Mrs. Pargeter, no, though she does frequent the shop often enough. This time it was a gentleman. Well-spoken, city manners, rather particular. Paid in coins, odd ones at that. Ink on his fingers, too."
Eyes shifting. "If you follow me." Miss Marple's fingers rested lightly on the counter, the smooth wood grounding her thoughts.
"I see," she said quietly, her mind piecing together the fragmentary image. Ink-stained fingers, a neat suit, a gentleman careful in his purchases. "Did you happen to note his name?" Mr. Finch shook his head, regretful. "No, ma'am, but I keep my notebook of orders. Sometimes small details are recorded there. If you like, I can fetch it." Miss Marple inclined her head politely. He returned moments later with the leather-bound notebook, flipping through pages of names and purchases. The handwriting was neat, almost precise, each entry reflecting the quiet order of the shop itself. Her eyes rested on one name, Collins. She lifted her gaze briefly, considering the subtle link to Rosehill Cottage, to the man she had met at the Swan Inn. A thread of possibility shimmered faintly in her mind, delicate yet resilient. "Thank you." "Mr. Finch," she said, returning the notebook to its place. She wandered slowly toward the window display, where baskets of sewing materials were arranged as if on gentle parade. Each one held spools of silk, ribbons and lace, their interiors hidden beneath tidy layers, secret yet perfectly ordinary in appearance. A casual observer might see only craftsmanship. Miss Marple saw history, small acts of choice, hints left behind like breadcrumbs along a path. She allowed her eyes to linger on the pale blue silk once more, noting how the sunlight struck it, revealing subtle variations in hue and texture. Each spool, each basket, was a quiet repository of intention, of need, of narrative waiting to be uncovered. Stepping back from the display, Miss Marple breathed softly, feeling the threads of evidence tightening in her mind. The day outside remained calm, the village quiet, yet she could sense the invisible weave of connections, delicate, precise, and pointing ever forward toward revelation. With a nod of thanks to Mr. Finch, she turned to leave, carrying with her not only the knowledge of the thread's purchaser, but the growing certainty that ordinary threads, when followed patiently, could lead to extraordinary truths. The Swan Inn was quieter than before, the afternoon sun spilling lazily through the mullioned windows. Miss Marple entered, the bell above the door tinkling softly, announcing her arrival without urgency. The warmth of the hearth welcomed her, the faint scent of polished wood and lingering tea mingling with the soft hum of conversation from the few patrons lingering in the common room. She was shown to the small table near the fire where Mr. Collins sat, a cup of tea before him, fingers absently drumming against the rim. His posture was polite yet taut, as though anticipating questions he hoped would never come. "Good afternoon, Mr. Collins," she said, settling opposite him. Her gaze, gentle yet attentive, drifted for a moment over the man's hands. The ink stains were subtle but unmistakable, faint smudges along the edges of his fingers that betrayed habitual work with pen and ledger. "I see your hands bear traces of past labours," she remarked softly, her voice lilting with curiosity rather than accusation. He glanced down, colour rising slightly to his temples. "Ah, yes.
I was a clerk in London once."
"Dismissed after a misunderstanding," he muttered, rubbing the stain on his cuff. The words were careful, measured, yet Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his voice. Her gaze moved to his cufflink.
"How neat," she observed almost casually.
"Repaired with pale blue thread, is it not?" She allowed her tone to remain gentle, almost conversational, though each word carried quiet weight. The cup before him wobbled slightly as his hand tightened around it, betraying the tension he tried to mask. I
don't know what you mean," he said, glancing quickly away.
Though the tremor of his hand betrayed him more eloquently than his words could, Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, eyes softening as if sharing a secret with the firelight itself. "You've been doing a bit of sewing yourself, I see," she said, her words carrying both observation and empathy. Perhaps it helps to soothe one's mind after difficulties. He swallowed, lips pressed thin, denying what he could not entirely hide. She allowed a pause, letting the warmth of the room, the gentle crackle of the fire, and the calm steadiness of her presence settle around him. Then, leaning slightly forward, she added softly, "And yet, you did know Mrs. Pargeter, did you not? I noticed her initials on a small handkerchief, C.W. His eyes flickered toward hers, a flash of unease passing across his face. He stammered, I hardly knew her, ma'am." Yet in that denial, Miss Marple caught the tiny shift in his expression, the almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes and mouth. Every careful word, every polite gesture spoke louder than any confession could. Rising, she smiled gently, a smile full of warmth and understanding, yet precise enough to linger in memory. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Collins," she said, her voice soft, leaving him with a quiet unease that did not need further words. The kind of smile that made one remember every half-truth told, every evasion, and the delicate pattern of honesty and deception that had already begun to unfold under her watchful eyes. Chapter 6. The Handkerchief's Secret. Miss Marple entered Lavender Cottage with the quiet weight of the evening pressing softly against the windows. The garden outside had surrendered to shadows, the last rays of sun melting into the hedgerows and casting delicate silhouettes across the path. She set down her basket, removed her gloves, and took the handkerchief Elsie had retrieved from Rosehill Cottage's sewing basket. The fabric was fine and pristine, its white cotton smooth beneath her fingers, but it carried a subtle weight, an intention woven into its delicate threads, almost imperceptible to anyone but an observant eye. She settled into her favourite chair by the fire, laying the handkerchief carefully across her lap. The flicker of the flames illuminated its fine embroidery, revealing the gentle sweep of initials, C.W., yet as her magnifying glass hovered above the hem, her eyes narrowed in quiet focus. Tiny, precise numbers were stitched almost invisibly along the edge, rendered in the same pale blue thread that had appeared in the sewing basket, along Mrs. Pargeter's projects, and even at Finch's shop, 523, 3 small digits. Unremarkable at first glance, yet their presence here seemed deliberate, purposeful. Miss Marple's mind turned, connecting threads of observation to patterns of behaviour she had noted over the past days. The initials were not a declaration of intimacy or affection, as one might have assumed in the superficial gossip of the village. No, they were a misdirection, a careful sleight of hand to draw attention elsewhere. Her lips pressed together softly. The blue thread, the embroidery, the midnight work in the parlour, it all pointed to something else entirely. She lifted the corner of the handkerchief, examining each stitch with meticulous care. Every movement of the needles spoke of precision, of intention, of a mind accustomed to concealment. 523 was not sentimentality, it was secrecy. A code, a lock, a hidden path. Miss Marple's mind recalled details she had gathered. The letters, the careful observation of Mr. Collins, the subtle misdirections whispered in conversation. Everything converged here, in this small domestic object. "Oh, my dear," she murmured softly, voice barely above the crackle of the fire. "You were trying to mend what could not be mended." Her fingers traced the hem once more, absorbing the tiny stitches, feeling the quiet desperation behind each deliberate mark. Mrs. Pargeter had not been embroidering a handkerchief for comfort or sentiment. She had been leaving behind evidence, an encrypted record of deeds she feared might otherwise vanish into obscurity. The initials C.W. now seemed almost ironic. The presumed lover, the assumed confidant, was not a romantic attachment at all, but a partner in matters darker and more intricate than anyone in the village had suspected. Every gentle motion of her needle, every careful thread of silk, had been a statement, a signal, a hidden testament to what had transpired behind closed doors. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, the lamplight softening the lines of thought on her face. Outside, the village settled into quiet, unaware that the domestic objects they took for granted, the handkerchief, the basket, the thread, held the key to unravelling the shadow that had fallen over Rose Hill Cottage. She allowed herself a moment to breathe, absorbing the quiet satisfaction of discovery, tempered by the melancholy of realizing the depth of human cleverness and frailty intertwined. The following morning, Lavender Cottage was bathed in pale sunlight, soft enough to warm the curtains without disturbing the calm of the room. Miss Marple had arranged a discreet visit with the vicar, who had kindly offered access to the parish records and his acquaintance with the local bank manager. Together they pored over ledgers and correspondence, the quiet rustle of paper blending with the occasional tapping of a pen on the desk. Each note, each entry, seemed mundane at first glance, yet Miss Marple read them like a carefully stitched pattern, each detail hinting at the larger design hidden beneath the surface. "See here," the vicar murmured, pointing to a faded entry, the joint account once held by Mr. Pargeter and a Mr. Collins. It appears to have been recently emptied of a considerable sum. Miss Marple's eyes softened in contemplation, tracing the lines of figures and dates. The numbers, precise and neat, were now more than mere bookkeeping. They were a record of intention, of secret transactions woven quietly into ordinary life. She noted the timing. The transfer occurred shortly before Mr. Pargeter's accident, the moment when a sudden misfortune had seemed to claim a husband, leaving a widow with apparent innocence. Yet, in the careful accounting, in the ledger's silent testimony, Miss Marple recognized the quiet shape of deceit. "The gentleman's hand is familiar," she said softly, almost to herself. Ink-stained fingers, accustomed to ledgers, careful in calculation. Yes, it all fits. The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered across the village and its domestic routines, now aligned with subtle precision. The initials C.W. had led observers to suspect romantic entanglement, yet here lay the truth. The marks pointed instead to a partner in financial betrayal, a man skilled at concealment, whose daily habits had betrayed more than he intended. She folded the ledger carefully, aware of the quiet significance in her hand. The paper's weight carried not merely numbers, but the echo of choices made in shadow, decisions that had rippled across the lives of those who trusted and observed. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, reflective sigh, imagining the faint snip of sewing scissors, the same decisive, final gesture that could end a thread or, in this case, a carefully orchestrated deception. Outside, the village remained serenely still, unaware that the ordinary rhythm of banking and domesticity had been the very stage upon which a quiet crime had been enacted. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the window pane, the sunlight glinting faintly against the glass, as though echoing the clarity she now felt inside. The truth, once hidden in subtle threads and careful records, had emerged, revealing a tale not of passion, but of deliberate, cold calculation. Her fingers rested briefly on the folded paper, the finality of the discovery tempered by the melancholy of human frailty. The story of Mrs. Pargeter and her hidden handkerchief, of the blue thread and the ink-stained clerk, was now laid bare, every stitch and figure accounted for. And in that quiet triumph of understanding, Miss Marple felt the satisfaction of a pattern resolved, the calm order of justice emerging softly from the shadows of village life. Chapter 7. The Final Stitch. The fire in Lavender Cottage cast a gentle, flickering glow across the room, dancing over the lace tablecloth and the delicate china that Miss Marple had set with meticulous care. The evening air was still, carrying only the faint scent of chamomile from the teapot. When Mr. Collins arrived, he seemed smaller somehow in the warm lamplight, shoulders hunched slightly, hands folded nervously in front of him. He greeted her with a polite, hesitant bow, eyes flicking toward the table, toward the basket resting quietly in the corner, and finally settling on Miss Marple herself. "Thank you for coming," she said softly, gesturing to the chair across from her. Her voice was calm, measured, carrying neither accusation nor threat, yet each word held weight. Mr. Collins seated himself, the teacup trembling slightly in his fingers. Miss Marple poured gently, allowing the warm aroma to fill the space between them. Silence lingered for a heartbeat, heavy yet unobtrusive, as if the room itself were waiting to exhale the truth. She reached into her basket and produced the handkerchief, laying it carefully upon the table. The pale blue numbers gleamed faintly in the lamplight, each stitch a quiet testament to hidden intentions and silent warnings. Her fingers rested lightly on the edge, neither pressing nor trembling, and she began to speak. Her tone soft but precise, each sentence deliberate, each word a measured stitch in the tapestry of revelation. "Mr. Collins," she began, "you were careful in your calculations, were you not? Each movement, each letter, every faint trace of ink. Yet there were threads you could not conceal. Mrs. Pargeter discovered your embezzlement. She meant to confess, to set right what had been mislaid, and in that quiet intention you intervened." He swallowed hard, eyes darting briefly toward the handkerchief before falling to the table. His voice, when it came, was a whisper, raw and uncertain.
I only meant to frighten her.
She was going to tell everyone.
And I did not mean. I never meant for her to...
His hands shook as the words faltered, leaving the sentence suspended between them. Miss Marple listened without interruption, absorbing the tremor of guilt, the faint sheen of fear, the subtle surrender in his posture. She did not need to speak. The quiet of the room, the soft pop of the fire, the gentle flicker of candlelight carried her understanding. The truth lay not in loud confession or dramatic flourish, but in the small, measured details he could not fully control. Finally, she covered the handkerchief with her hand, letting her fingers rest lightly over the embroidered numbers and initials. Her voice was low, calm, and imbued with gentle gravity. "Some stains," she said softly, "do not wash out." The words hung in the air, a quiet judgment rather than a condemnation, carrying the moral weight of what had occurred. Mr. Collins lowered his gaze, and the tension that had gripped his frame softened, replaced by the heavy, silent recognition of consequence. Outside, the village slept under the faint silver light of the moon, unaware that justice had been enacted not with spectacle, but with subtle observation, patience, and the careful unweaving of human deceit. Miss Marple allowed a slow exhale, letting the warmth of the lamplight and the soft rhythm of her breathing fill the space. The handkerchief remained between them, a delicate, domestic artifact of truth, and in the gentle quiet, the threads of events, of choices and errors, were finally acknowledged, leaving only the calm, measured weight of understanding and resolution. The morning mist lay thick over St. Mary Mead, curling around the hedgerows and softening the edges of rooftops, chimneys, and garden gates. The village was quiet, the usual morning clatter of footsteps and carts subdued under the silvery blanket. Miss Marple stood at her own gate, her hands folded calmly in front of her, the pale light illuminating her serene expression. The dew clung delicately to the spiderwebs in her garden, each tiny thread sparkling like spun silver in the soft dawn. The air smelled faintly of earth and grass, of beginnings and quiet continuities, and she breathed it in with her usual gentle composure. A soft footfall disturbed the stillness, and Miss Marple looked up to see Inspector Craddock approaching, his coat dampened by the mist. Behind him, Mr. Collins walked with careful restraint, shoulders slumped, the weight of acknowledgment heavy upon him. Villagers had gathered discreetly in doorways, curious but respectful, whispering softly among themselves. Some faces were pale, others averted, yet all watched with a quiet fascination, observing the gentle administration of justice in a world that had returned, for the moment, to order. "Good morning." "Miss Marple," Craddock said quietly, tipping his hat. Thank you for your insight. It has made all the difference." She inclined her head, her lips curving into a faint, knowing smile. "One simply observes human nature," she replied softly, as though explaining a simple truth rather than passing judgment. There was no triumph, no harshness, only the calm satisfaction of understanding threads of behaviour and weaving them into clarity. As Craddock and his constables led Mr. Collins down the lane, the mist seemed to follow them, curling around boots and hems, softening the scene into a quiet tableau of consequence rather than spectacle. Miss Marple watched without haste, her eyes lingering on the faint blue of his sleeve, the memory of ink-stained fingers and trembling hands now folded into the narrative of resolution. The villagers' whispers dissolved into the damp morning air. Carried away by the gentle breeze, turning back toward her own garden, she noticed the small details of life resumed. Dew on the rosebuds, a spider's web gleaming with moisture, the distant church bells beginning their soft toll. The ordinary rhythm of the village, the constancy of domestic routines, seemed restored. Somewhere in the quiet, the kettle began to sing in her kitchen, a simple, familiar sound that carried warmth and reassurance through the still air. Miss Marple returned to her embroidery, the frame resting lightly in her lap, the needle catching the first weak sunbeams that penetrated the mist. Each stitch moved with purpose, a soft, methodical rhythm echoing the calm order she had restored to the village. The events of the past days, the death, the hidden threads, the small betrayals and revelations had been acknowledged, understood, and set into their rightful place, like the precise arrangement of stitches in a well-woven piece. Outside, the mist began to lift, revealing a village that seemed unchanged yet subtly wiser, softened by experience but undisturbed by chaos. Inside, Miss Marple's needle flashed quietly in the morning light, each movement a quiet testament to patience, observation, and the gentle triumph of clarity over confusion. Life, as always, continued its modest, comforting course. Chapter 8. The Last Thread. The garden at Lavender Cottage was soft with early spring light, dew clinging to the tulip leaves and petals in gentle droplets that gleamed like tiny jewels. Miss Marple moved quietly among the flower beds, her hands brushing tenderly against the stems, adjusting stakes and straightening leaves. Each tulip, upright and colourful, seemed to reflect the delicate order of her thoughts, the calm rhythm of life that persisted even after shadows had passed. She paused for a moment, inhaling the faint fragrance of damp earth and blossoms, letting the simple, tangible beauty of the garden soothe the quiet memory of recent events. A cheerful knock at the door broke her reverie. Mrs. Bantry arrived, carrying a basket filled with warm scones, the scent of baking mingling with the fresh spring air, and a little hint of gossip tucked beneath the napkin. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said warmly, setting the basket down on the garden table. "I thought you might like something sweet to accompany your tulips." Miss Marple smiled, gesturing for her neighbour to sit, and poured tea into delicate china cups. They spoke lightly of the coming church fete, of lace to be mended, ribbons to be tied, and the small joys of village life resuming its gentle course. Conversation drifted with ease, punctuated by laughter and the soft clink of china, a comforting rhythm in which worries and whispers found their proper, contained place. Yet as Mrs. Bantry chattered on about the latest recipe she had tried, Miss Marple's eyes wandered to her sewing basket, resting on a nearby chair. A single spool of blue thread remained, delicate and vivid against the worn wood of the table. She picked it up and turned it thoughtfully in her fingers, feeling the smooth silk slide gently through her fingers. Small domestic objects, she reflected, often concealed the most important truths, and even in their quiet ordinariness, they carried the memory of human intention. "Error and cleverness, we mend, we patch, we move on," she said softly, voice almost a whisper over the clinking teacups. "But the pattern of truth, that, my dear,
is never lost." Her eyes rested on the spool of blue thread.
on the lace and the ribbons awaiting their turn to be attended to, and on the tulips glowing in the morning sun. There was a satisfaction in order restored, a quiet acknowledgement that while human frailty might tangle threads, careful attention and gentle observation could always reveal the pattern beneath. Mrs. Bantry nodded, smiling knowingly, sensing both the calm wisdom and the gentle authority in Miss Marple's words. Outside, the village awoke fully, bathed in the soft light of day, unaware of the mysteries that had quietly passed through its streets, leaving only the subtle, enduring marks of truth. Inside the garden tea was poured, scones were shared, and life continued in its modest, comforting rhythm, measured, calm, and quietly victorious over the shadows of human deceit. The evening settled over Lavender Cottage with a hushed reverence, the last rays of sun slipping behind the hedgerows and painting the garden in soft amber tones. Miss Marple sat comfortably in her favourite chair, embroidery frame resting lightly on her lap. The room was quiet except for the occasional whisper of the needle sliding through cloth and the gentle tick of the mantel clock, marking time with a steady, soothing rhythm. Each movement of her hand was deliberate, almost meditative, tracing a small, delicate blue flower into the fabric, its petals precise, perfect, a miniature testament to patience and care. The garden outside had surrendered to shadow, yet the faint glow of lamps from neighbouring cottages shimmered through the windows, warm and steady. The air carried a delicate chill, mingling with the scent of lavender and polished wood inside. Miss Marple's eyes, calm and reflective, traced the familiar shapes of her sewing basket and the tools it held. The scissors gleamed faintly where they rested, a small reminder of the decisive moments that had unravelled the threads of the village mystery. The folded handkerchief, once a repository of secret numbers and misdirection, now lay perfectly smooth, its story concluded yet preserved, a quiet symbol of truth restored. She paused, taking in the simple beauty of her surroundings, the glow of the lamp illuminating the folds of the lace tablecloth, the carefully arranged tulips that had survived the morning dew, and the soft silhouettes of her garden beyond the window. Everything was in place, measured, harmonious, and yet she allowed herself a thought for the small, invisible threads that connected people and events, threads that could easily be overlooked, yet carried the weight of consequence and revelation. Human nature? She murmured softly to herself, almost as if speaking to the room itself, is a tapestry stitched with both care and error.
Murder is simply the shadow cast by frailty.
Yet there is always light enough to see the pattern, if one knows where to look. Her voice was low, calm and comforting, carrying no judgment but the quiet clarity of understanding. Each word hung lightly in the air, blending with the rhythmic clicking of her needle and the gentle sway of evening shadows. The clock chimed gently, its soft tolling echoing through the room like a heartbeat, marking the passing of a day that had begun in mist and uncertainty and ended in measured, quiet resolution. Miss Marple allowed her gaze to linger on the small blue flower she had stitched, a tiny emblem of beauty and precision born from careful observation and thought. The room seemed to hold its breath with her, aware of the delicate balance between curiosity and closure, between the shadow of human missteps and the light of understanding. As the final threads were tucked neatly into place, she set the embroidery frame aside, letting her hands rest. The village outside slept, lamps glowing softly, chimneys releasing faint wraiths of smoke, and the gentle rhythm of domestic life continued uninterrupted. Miss Marple's eyes wandered one last time to her sewing basket, the faint glint of scissors catching the last light, the folded handkerchief now perfectly still. In that quiet, she felt the serene satisfaction of a pattern recognized, a truth revealed, and a day, like a thread, completed. The room softened into stillness. The garden, the village, and the quiet cottage all exhaled together, and in the calm, delicate hush the story lingered, balanced between reflection, closure, and the faint whisper of threads that connect every life.